The recording played for 4 seconds before Lionel Richie stopped playing. His fingers left the keys. His head dropped forward. Jimmy Fallon couldn't hold back his tears, and 300 people in Studio 6B held their breath, as a voice they had never expected to hear again filled every corner of that room. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The band behind the curtain went quiet without being told to. The cameras kept rolling because nobody in the booth thought to call cut. Lionel Richie sat with his hands in his lap and his eyes closed, and the voice on the recording kept going. It was a Tuesday night in mid-November. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon was filming at Studio 6B at 30 Rockefeller Plaza, and everything was going exactly as planned. The guest that night was Lionel Richie, which meant the audience had been electric from the moment the doors opened. This was the man who had written Hello, who had written All Night Long, who had written Endless Love, a catalog that lived somewhere in the memory of every person in that room. 300 strangers had come in from the cold for exactly this. The roots were settled into their corner, easy and warm. Questlove's drumsticks were moving in slow circles between his fingers, comfortable, unhurried. The audience had been seated for 30 minutes already, still buzzing, still leaning over to strangers in adjacent seats to say something about the song they hoped he'd play. Jimmy Fallon came out, and the room lifted. He was loose, happy. The way he gets when he knows it's going to be a good one. He said something about the guest that made the front 4 rows erupt before he'd even finished the sentence. Then Lionel Richie walked out. And the room didn't lift. The room roared. He sat at the piano at the edge of the stage, the dark grand place there specifically for tonight, and played 8 bars of something just to feel the room. The audience responded as if he had played the greatest song they had ever heard. Because for a lot of them, he had. The interview started. Lionel Richie was everything you expect him to be in a room, warm, funny, self-deprecating in a way that makes you love him more rather than less. He talked about the new work. He talked about his kids. He talked about what it felt like, honestly, to still be filling arenas after all this time. Jimmy was laughing. Everything was flowing exactly as it should. Then Jimmy asked him when he knew. It was the question Jimmy had been saving. You could tell, the slight pause before it, the way he leaned back into his chair rather than forward. The way he let the room get a half-second quieter before he spoke. When did you know this was really going to be your life? When was the moment you stopped hoping and started knowing? Lionel Richie smiled. The real one, not the performing one. He started to answer. And as he began, the woman standing behind the soundboard at the back of the studio gave a small nod to the technician beside her. A signal they had rehearsed 3 times that afternoon without telling almost anyone else in the building. The technician put on his headphones. He pressed play. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1968. Lionel Richie wasn't always Lionel Richie legend. In the autumn of 1968, he was 20 years old and studying at Tuskegee University in Alabama. He was writing songs in his dorm room late at night, certain of the music in a way he wasn't yet certain of much else. The Commodores hadn't broken through. The tours, the Motown contract, the stadium nights, none of that existed yet. He was just a young man with a piano and a quiet belief that what he was feeling could be felt by other people too, if he could only find the right words for it. That autumn, a woman named Ruth came to hear him play. She was 43 years old, and she had driven 2 hours from Birmingham in a second-hand Buick with a broken heater, because her nephew, a student at Tuskegee, had called her and said, "Aunt Ruth, you need to come hear this boy play." She taught music at a public elementary school in Birmingham. Had been teaching for 16 years. She had a gift for finding children who needed music before they knew they needed it, and she spent those 16 years giving it to them quietly. Without recognition, because that was what she understood her life to be for. She sat in the second row of a small hall with maybe 80 seats and listened to Lionel Richie play 3 songs. He doesn't remember all 3. He remembers the last one, Written 2 weeks earlier, in a single sitting, midnight to 3 in the morning. A song about longing. About the feeling of loving something you haven't found yet. He played it slowly that night. Honestly, the way you play something when you're not yet sure it's good enough. When it ended, Ruth didn't applaud right away. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes still focused on where his fingers had been. Then she stood up. She walked to the front of the room. She looked at him directly and she said, "Young man, that song is going to outlive us both." He didn't know what to say. He was 20 years old and nobody had ever spoken to him that way about his music. He thanked her. He asked her name. She told him, Ruth Dawson. She shook his hand with both of hers and she said, "Don't stop. Whatever else happens, don't stop." Then she drove 2 hours back to Birmingham in the cold. He never forgot it. Not the song she'd heard. Not the words she said. Not the way she held his hand with both of hers. Over the years, when the career accelerated and the rooms got bigger, and the songs started reaching places he had never imagined, he thought about Ruth Dawson the way you think about the people who handed you something essential before you knew you needed it. He tried to find her, twice. Once in the late 1970s. Once again in the early 1990s. Both times the trail went cold. Then, 14 months ago, a letter arrived at his management office. Written in careful, slanted cursive on pale yellow paper. It was from Ruth's granddaughter Serena, a third-grade teacher in Atlanta. The letter explained that Ruth was 98 years old, still in her own home in Birmingham. Still, Serena had underlined this, playing his records in the mornings while she made coffee. Ruth had been given a diagnosis. Stage 4. 4 months, maybe less. And the letter explained that Ruth had made one request. Not a visit. Not a phone call. To hear, one more time, the song he had played that night in 1968. Performed the way he had performed it then. Slow, honest, in a room small enough that she could feel it. Serena had recorded her grandmother saying this. A voice recording on her phone. 37 seconds long. Ruth's voice still clear and deliberate even now, saying, "I just want to hear it the way he played it that night. Before I go. That's all." It was this recording that Lionel Richie's team had arranged, in complete secrecy, to play through the studio speakers on a Tuesday night in November. Ruth Dawson was in seat 1 of row 1. Serena was beside her. Neither of them had been told exactly what was going to happen. They had been told only, "Come, and be ready." Behind the scenes, Lionel Richie had made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. He had told the Tonight Show team that he wanted no introduction for what was about to happen. No explanation. No setup from Jimmy. He had said, "Just play it. When I'm at the piano, and Jimmy asks the question, just play it. Whatever happens after that, is whatever happens." He had not seen Ruth Dawson since that night, in 1968. He did not know exactly where she was sitting. He had been told only that she was in the room. When Jimmy asked him when he knew, "When did you stop hoping and start knowing?" the woman at the soundboard gave her nod. Now in Studio 6B, Lionel Richie and Ruth Dawson were in the same room for the first time in 56 years. And only 4 people in the building knew it. Ruth's voice came through the speakers. Not loud. Just present. The way a voice is present when it belongs to someone who learned a long time ago that you don't need to raise your voice to be heard. "I just want to hear it the way he played it that night. Before I go. That's all." Lionel Richie's hands came off the keys. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. He didn't look for her immediately. He sat very still. The way a person sits when they are trying to stay inside a feeling long enough to understand it. His eyes were closed. His hands were in his lap. The recording had ended, but the room was holding on to the sound of it, the way a room does after something real has moved through it. Then he opened his eyes. He turned toward the audience slowly. And in the way that some things simply happen, not because of logic, not because of searching, his eyes found the woman in seat 1 of row 1. 98 years old, sitting straight, looking directly at him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Lionel Richie put both hands over his heart. Jimmy Fallon had been watching from his desk. He had 3 words out, he had started to say something, the instinct of a host filling silence. And then he stopped. He looked at Lionel. He looked at the woman in row 1. He understood. He sat back and he did not say another word. The entire studio froze. Lionel Richie stood up from the piano bench. He walked to the edge of the stage. He looked down at Ruth Dawson and his voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. But his microphone caught every word. He said, "You came." She said, "I told you I believed in you." He laughed. A short, full laugh that broke through whatever he had been holding. He stepped down from the stage, a stagehand moved toward him and he waved them off, and walked to the front row and crouched down level with Ruth, and took her hands in his the way she had taken his hands 56 years ago, with both of his, holding on. She said, "You didn't stop." He said, "I heard you." Her hands were trembling, his were too. Serena, beside her, had both hands pressed to her mouth. Jimmy Fallon had left his desk. No one told him to. He had simply stood up, walked to the edge of the stage and sat down on the top step, jacket off, elbows on his knees, watching the way you watch something you already know you'll never forget. Questlove stood up from the drum kit. Slowly, quietly, he just stood. The camera operator in the center of the floor did not cut away. The director in the booth did not call for commercial. The studio held. Lionel Richie walked back to the piano. He sat down. He looked at Ruth Dawson in seat 1, row 1. And he said, "This one's always been yours, Ruth." And he played the song. The one from 1968. Slow, honest, the Roots didn't play. No one accompanied him. Just the piano. Just his voice. In a studio in New York City. And a woman of 98 years in the front row, listening with her eyes closed and her granddaughter's hand in hers. Jimmy Fallon was openly crying. Not quietly. Not privately. In front of the cameras, without trying to stop, and not caring. Questlove was crying. The cameramen were crying. 300 people who had come to see a television show sat in complete silence. Some of them holding the hands of strangers. All of them understanding that what was happening in front of them had nothing to do with television. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. When the last note faded, the studio stayed silent for 5 full seconds. Then the sound came. Not applause, not yet. Just breath. The long collective exhale of 300 people releasing something they had been holding. Jimmy Fallon stood up from the stage steps. He walked back to his desk. He put both hands flat on it and looked at the audience and said, "Some things you can't plan. Some things just need to happen." He looked at Ruth. He said, "Thank you for driving 2 hours in a broken heater in 1968. Ruth Dawson smiled. She said, "It was worth it both times." The studio laughed the way people laugh when they are still halfway inside something that made them cry. Full and relieved and grateful. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. After the cameras stopped, Lionel Richie stayed at that piano for 50 minutes. He played songs he hadn't performed in decades. Ruth sat in the front row and listened to every one of them. Serena sat beside her, and didn't say a word, and didn't need to. 2 months later, Lionel Richie opened the American leg of his tour in Birmingham, Alabama. The first song he played was the song from 1968. Before he played it, he said nothing. No introduction, no story, no explanation. He simply sat down at the piano, looked out at the audience, and began. Ruth Dawson passed away 6 weeks after the taping. She was at home, in her own bed, in Birmingham. Serena told the family she had been peaceful. Serena also said that in the weeks after the show, Ruth had played the clip every single morning while she made her coffee. The same way she had always played his records. Because some rituals don't change just because they've been completed. The pale yellow letter Ruth's granddaughter had written, the one that had started all of this, sits now in a frame on a shelf in Lionel Richie's home studio, next to a photograph of a small concert hall at Tuskegee University, 80 seats, taken sometime in the late 1960s. He sees it every time he sits down to write. Every night before he walks out onto a stage. Lionel Richie stops for a moment. Just a moment. He thinks about a woman who drove 2 hours in a broken heater to hear a 20-year-old boy play a song about longing. He thinks about what she said. And then he walks out. Not for the crowd, not for the cameras, not for any of this. Because kindness echoes. And sometimes you spend 56 years becoming worthy of the voice that believed in you first. Some songs wait a lifetime for the room they were always meant to fill.